Mueller report round the corner.
The Dan York State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
Alrighty, we are on a Friday evening always taking this risk. And the risk is because we record our Friday programs on Thursday afternoons, that something big changed in the midst of what was happening in Washington. Although I will tell you, it's so important for us to keep a perspective here on what's happening there. Because there is so much, going on. Timothy Edgar is my guest. He's my go-to guy on national security issues. He's a fair-minded person on the politics. He's been in Washington and served both parties of administration. And he's a guy I bang all this stuff off of, and I know that you guys enjoy seeing him. So let's get to it on this Friday evening. Yesterday's headline about the Mueller report kind of accelerating here. Here was the latest that we had at press time.
During a White House meeting with the Austrian Chancellor, President Trump wouldn't say whether or not Special Counsel Robert Mueller's report should be made public.
That'll be totally up to the new Attorney General. He's a tremendous man, a tremendous person who really respects this country and respects the Justice Department, so that'll be totally up to him.
That report, looking at Russian interference in the 2016 election and possible collusion, is expected to be completed in the next few weeks before Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein departs in mid-March. The president is also locked in a back and forth with the New York Times after the paper reported he asked former acting Attorney General Matt Whitaker to put U.S. Attorney Jeffrey Berman in charge of the case involving the president's former personal attorney, Michael Cohen, even though Berman, considered an ally of the president's, had already recused himself from the investigation. President Trump tweeted Wednesday, "The New York Times reporting is false. They are the true enemy of the people." The New York Times is defending its reporting, and the president's tweet prompted a response from the paper. Times publisher A.G. Sulzberger put out a statement reading in part, "The phrase enemy of the people is not just false, it's dangerous. As I have repeatedly told President Trump face to face, there are mounting signs that this incendiary rhetoric is encouraging threats and violence against journalists at home and abroad."
I don't know how anybody could argue that, Tim.
No.
Welcome again. Appreciate you being here.
Sure.
I can go to the radio show and I can have the first 13 people who dial the show talk about how Donald Trump is correct and the press is the enemy of the people. And those are the same people who, by the way, if they were wronged on an issue locally, would be going to a newspaper or a mainstream media outlet locally for redress. It's just, this thing is completely out of control.
It's dangerous because we take this for granted as Americans. The press is one of the most important functions we have as a democracy. And to not have a free press is the first sign of a dictatorship. So that's absolutely right. I mean, we absolutely should be able to criticize the press harshly. But to use a phrase like enemy of the people, that's dictator talk.
Non-stop now. I mean, This is, and I wonder if this is just his habit go to default or whether this feels like an acceleration to you.
It seems to me like it's desensitization. You know, you use this kind of, you go to your most powerful drug. Let's use a sort of dictator phrase, enemy of the people. Let's talk about fake news. And you keep repeating it over and over again. It doesn't have any effect. Nobody pays attention when Trump says enemy of the people anymore. Nobody pays any attention when he says fake news. Those would have been shocking, at the beginning of the administration.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, and I know where you're going, and I agree with your premise. But I'd add a caveat, which is that while it's desensitizing, it has built the foundational unnecessary distrust.
Yes.
Right?
Well, I think when I say it's desensitizing, I mean it's not having the effect he wants, which is to kind of shock us. It's still very dangerous, and we need to not be desensitized. That's really important. To have the President of the United States, who swears an oath to uphold the Constitution, including the First Amendment that protects the freedom of the press, to be attacking the press in language that we would see from some dictator overseas is just, it's a violation of everything that this country stands for.
It feels like we need some historical perspective on this in terms of the antagonism between the executive branch and the press, anybody in government and the press. I don't want to get too over my skis on this. This is not the first time we've talked about this. You're right. Early on, it was like, what's he doing? And then we just kind of roll our eyes. But in lieu of some equitable example of this kind of never-ending, almost security threat to the First Amendment, who in Washington is going to step up and try to stamp this out? At what point does Congress say, you know what, we have to write a resolution here. We've got to make it. What vehicle does Congress have to react, sanction, condemn, whatever?
Sure. I think this is all going to factor into Congress's reaction to the next phase of the Russia investigation. They're going to have to consider a report from Robert Mueller, and that's going to put the spotlight on them. And if they're going to be considering possible grounds for impeachment, these are exactly the kinds of things that are, not really legal considerations about what crimes may or may not have been committed, but constitutional considerations. Is this the right thing to do? Should we go forward with something like impeachment, or should we lay off and let the American people decide next year in an election?
Well, I would think, I'm seeing this enemy of the people thing as its own separate problem. The grounds for impeachment, if they exist, it seems like we'll know soon enough. We'll talk about the timing of the Mueller probe coming up. But on its own, these tweets and these attacks on the press, and specifically the New York Times for a single 20-page report they put out, is it not time for a bipartisan reaction from the legislative branch of government, at least?
Certainly, it's past time. I mean, you heard what the publisher
Who's the player?
said.
I'm trying to think who the player would be. They would say, all right, enough is enough.
At a minimum, I think that the relevant committees in Congress should be looking at what the publisher of the New York Times just said, which is that he's getting threats. That's a public safety concern. Domestic terrorism, the idea that this rhetoric might encourage someone to commit a terrorist attack is something that I'd want to ask the head of the FBI, the head of DHS, and other agencies that have to deal with threats, and what are they doing about it, and how does this kind of rhetoric complicate their job and mission?
Do you think it would be credible to actually take the president's rhetoric as worrisome enough to create hearings specifically on that?
Yes, I think if you take that together with the Charlottesville comments, the continuing threat of domestic terrorism, we just had another incident in Maryland with a fellow who was stockpiling weapons and wanted to go after liberals and professors and other people that he thought were part of some liberal elite conspiracy. This kind of incendiary rhetoric coming from the President of the United States has to gin that up, and that is certainly a valid oversight concern, at least for the Congress, and I do think it's a question of the fitness of the President for office.
I wonder if the publisher should go as far, and whether the journalistic community should go as far collectively to say, this has got to stop. We are asking for some kind of formal process or redress on the President's term, enemy of the people. I just think it's gotten to the point where you just can't say, it's just him. It's way too volatile.
I agree, and I think one of the things that's been such a disappointment is where are the Senate Republicans on this? It doesn't have the same effect if it's just Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats. Even if they're right, it's not going to work if they don't have backing from Senate Republicans to try to rein in that kind of dangerous rhetoric.
I wonder whether the New York Times and like organizations have had to invest in extra security just every time something like this happens. They'd be crazy not to.
I think they should. I think that not just for this reason, but also other domestic terrorist threats have been out there, and we're in a very volatile time.
All right, when we come back, we'll dig into this Mueller report, timing of it. Andrew McCabe is finishing up his week-long tour. Fascinating. We'll be right back. So this headline, I actually try to get to it, but I'm very concerned about the enemy of the people stuff from this president. I don't think it's something that we just fluff past. But let's move on to the original first segment subject, Tim, and that is the Mueller report. Now, new Attorney General Barr, I think, did a credible job in the hearings of kind of setting himself as a guy who respects the Justice Department and will do what he can to make this report public as far as he can extend that through the regulations that restrict or give him restrictive options. It's a very murky place, what you do with the special counsel report. What do you think about this reported timing that the Mueller report is wrapping up?
Well, we've heard that for a long time, but it seems to
three
be
times,
yeah,
right?
it seems to be real this time. Partly because people who work for Mueller are calling up their old bosses and saying, "I'm coming home, back to my old job." So I think it is probably happening, and the most important thing is that the Attorney General make as much of it public as he possibly can. I think there are at least two reasons that you might redact something. National security, obviously, if there's classified information. The other reason might be if there's unverified information that could harm someone's reputation, who they're not charging, they're not implicating. That's the kind of stuff you want to not make public. But as much of it as you can possibly make public really should be, so the public can judge whether there's additional information that Mueller has uncovered that might implicate the president. That's really, I think, the number one issue everybody is still waiting for an answer from Mueller on.
Do you think, is it your instinct at all that this thing is running its natural course, or that this new Attorney General is pulling the plug? Or saying, let's go?
It's hard to know. It's hard to know because I think one of the things that was delaying the report last year was the president's lack of cooperation with Mueller. Mueller wanted to interview him under conditions that we've seen in other previous presidents have agreed to, going back to Bill Clinton, and President Trump was having none of it. And that was delaying things for a while. So one question I would want to ask is, did the new Attorney General come in there and say, okay, look, drop that and just issue your report, or was this something Mueller was planning to do anyway? We don't know the answer to that.
The report, I think there's a danger in rising expectations for the report. The chances for indications of criminality are not necessarily that high through this report.
I think that's right, because you've got a couple things going on here. The first is a lot of people forget Robert Mueller is examining one specific thing, which is Russian interference in the 2016 election. He's indicted a bunch of Russians. He's indicted a bunch of people who refused or obstructed the inquiry, lied to investigators. But he is not out there to examine everything that Trump may or may not have done over the past, several years. Many of Trump's legal problems have nothing to do with Robert Mueller. He's being investigated by the Southern District of New York over campaign finance. The lawyer, Michael Cohen, his foundation is the Attorney General of New York.
Which is by the way, next Wednesday we have Cohen coming in for public testimony, which could actually run concurrent with a Mueller report issuance and dwarf it.
That's absolutely right. I mean, we know a lot right now already about what Trump, did or didn't do with the Russians in 2016, how he's tried to obstruct the Mueller probe. The New York Times laid out that story in a very comprehensive, basically just summary of what we already knew. That was what prompted that tweet we were talking about. So Trump's legal woes are not going to be over after the Mueller report comes out. He's still got a lot of legal problems to worry about.
Well, we'll be able to ascertain the answer to this question when the report comes out, but let's not forget about the handful of people who've either been indicted, convicted, or done some jail time. I don't know whether there's going to be correlation, but, God rest his soul, former Mayor Buddy Cianci went to jail having been found not guilty on any predicate counts of behavior, yet was found guilty of heading the conspiracy.
Right.
At what I guess Mueller will have to, without indicting necessarily, would have to use language to suggest that responsibility and awareness
It's a
was on Trump's head, and that's when I think everyone looks at it and says, "Oh, brother." Right?
That's a very good analogy, I think. And part of the difference here is that because Robert Mueller just has one piece of the investigation, the Russia piece, and because the Justice Department has a long-standing policy that they do not indict a sitting president, this really is a matter for Congress. It's really a matter for Congress to decide, put all these things together and say, does this rise to the level of some kind of impeachable offense? That's question one. And then question two is, even if it does, is that what we think we should do, or should we take some other action? There is some, say, historical precedent for censure, and of course, we have an election coming up. So that's where the political considerations start getting wrapped into this sort of legal question about impeachable offenses.
And remember, impeachment is a House of Representatives action. Conviction is
That's
a
right.
Senate action. There's a long travel there.
That's absolutely.
Mueller has a lot of pressure on himself, it seems, in the wording of this report, and then Attorney General Barr has the discretion to edit it if he wants to, and then if he does, if he does he have to declare that he did?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer to it. I do hope that that's as transparent as possible. That's the kind of thing where Mueller may have some power here, because Mueller would be able to say, this isn't what I said. I mean, I don't know that he would do that. So I think those would need to be worked out, or else it could be a big disaster politically. But I was going to say that the precedent here, I think, is we're going to get, in my guess, my opinion, a very different kind of report than we did back in the 90s with Ken Starr. Ken Starr had a voluminous, a really thick report, detailed blow by blow, and really kind of aggressively making the case that Clinton should be impeached. And he was seen, I think, criticized, I think correctly so, as you're acting like a partisan Republican. That's not what we want from an independent prosecutor. I think Mueller will take a different approach. I think he will have a much shorter report that will just lay out the facts and will say, this is what we found, and now it's up to Congress and the American people to make a judgment about the president. Now, when it comes to people other than the president, he's already brought indictments, of course, and so those are probably, assuming that he's wrapping this up, as we've been told, it's unlikely we're going to see new indictments, I would say, in the next few days. That just seems unlikely.
Yet Congress can also use this report as a basis for their own investigation.
That's exactly what they should do.
They could ask Bob Mueller to come in.
That's exactly what they should do, because up until now, this is one of the problems with special prosecutors and independent counsels, is it gives the Congress a way to get out of one of its core constitutional responsibilities. It is their job to investigate and decide on issues of impeachment. And when you have a special counsel out there, everyone on any side of the issue can say, well, let's just wait until the special counsel's done. Now that the special counsel is done, it puts it squarely on them. They have to make the tough calls about whether to go forward with impeachment or not, or do something else.
All right, we got to get a take on Andrew McCabe and his story when we come back. Stay with us. Can this guy do this?
Well,
Are you concerned about that?
that is a serious question, and I'll tell you, it's not just the temperament of the president, although I think that is one of the challenges. It's also the institutional incapacity. We don't have ambassadors in critical countries, and we don't have not an ambassador in Turkey. We don't have an ambassador in Egypt. We don't have an ambassador in Saudi Arabia. We don't have an ambassador in so many countries where you need a State Department presence to make these decisions, or to help make these decisions. The National Security Council has been upset several times. They fired McMaster's. They now have Bolton in. We have an acting Secretary of Defense. So one of the
And you got a DNI that's going to get popped here this week, reportedly.
that could be the case. Director Coates.
Yeah,
Possibly the case. But so you have a situation where you don't have the institutional capacity that President Kennedy had.
So that was an answer to the question. I had been talking with a senator about having seen the movie 13 Days in a late night, 2 o'clock in the morning,
Sure.
HBO thing.
Great
right?
movie.
Right? But the minute-to-minute operational and strategic decisions and pressure that were on the Kennedys is gripping, even more so now that you wonder immediately, would this president have the capacity to make all those calls? That was the premise of the question that I was asking Jack Reed. He, by the way, didn't get in on the McCabe thing too much, but combination of both. McCabe's discussion about Putin being more reliable on security than his own intel. What was your take on that?
It's, you know, unfortunately, we're talking about desensitizing. I'm desensitized. I mean, he's already said this. President Trump in public, I believe, a few times. Said it many times in private, according to the reports we've seen. So it just confirms what we already knew. He just lacks basic judgment skills about what's important when it comes to national security. He looks at national security in terms of how does it affect his personal sort of approval and view of the world instead of how it affects the national security of the United States.
I still have to ask the question all the time. How did we get here? How did we get to the place where America hears that and says, whatever?
Well, that's a long conversation, but it certainly has a lot to do with people, I think, going into their tribes and saying, you know, my guy is how I think about the world. You know, people looked at, before Trump came along, you would look at a poll, let's say, of more conservative or Republican types, and they'd be more hawkish on the issue of Russia. Then Trump comes along, and people would say, well, how's he going to deal with the fact that his people feel this way? And then they change their mind about Russia, not for any reason having to do with Russia, but just because, you know, they like Trump, so if Trump likes Russia, then I have to like Russia.
Do you find McCabe credible with this tour?
I do. You know, his being dismissed was really based on, you know, even if you take that Inspector General report totally at face value, it's based on a mistake that he made in talking to the Inspector General about talking to the press. As we were talking about, he was authorized to talk to the press. So it's very much you know, so I think he comes across as completely credible. It's consistent with what other people have said about the situation in early 2017. He's facing enormous pressures in the wake of Comey's firing, and I think he's clearly, like Comey, someone whose principal loyalty is to the institution of the FBI and of the national security establishment.
And it doesn't, real quick, it doesn't lessen your thought on it that Comey and now McCabe have written books about it.
Not at all. I think they felt they had an obligation, given how crazy the situation has been, to let the public know what was going on.
Which reminds me, make sure you pick up the book Beyond Snowden, which is Timothy's latest essay, which is all about security, surveillance, technology, and all of that. We'll remind you on the website about that and how you can get that book. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Always great to see you. Oh, be right back. So next week could be an incredible week because the Mueller report may come out, it may not, but Michael Cohen will be in front of Congress on Wednesday, it looks like, and that could be just a three-ring circus. Keep your eyes on that. Of course, always keep your eyes on the prizes here at home on Monday when we reconvene. We'll take a look at what seems to be a fourth saga now that needs scrutiny in the city of Warwick regarding the fire department issues and transparency, and the mayor, according to a Target 12 report this week, admitting that the FBI is taking a look at things there. So be aware that's our Monday conversation. In the meantime, you have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you on the radio at 3 on Monday. I'm back here Monday night. Good night.